Thank you. So James, those of you who participated in previous sessions will remember James from session 3. James Reuter is an associate professor in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta. James conducts research in the areas of trade policy, agricultural marketing, and price analysis, specifically on the economic impacts of multilateral and regional integration agreements. He has published a recent article on COVID-19 and the Canadian beef sector that he also shared some of that with us in the previous session, as well as prior research in various Canadian agricultural policy instruments. And with that, I'll turn it over to James.
Okay, thank you, Brent. Hopefully I won't fall into Mencken's trap. I'm certainly going to try to provide clear and simple answers, but unfortunately, complexity usually overtakes us. What I want to start off with is a rationale for intervention, and economists tend to divide the world up into two reasons. First of all, to redistribute income, and usually there are arguments about rent-seeking behavior associated with it, or some governments intervene to correct for some sort of a market failure. I think we can argue that this is a market failure, but certainly there are elements of rent-seeking behavior associated with the policies that are, or the call for policies that are coming out. So the basic question is, does the sector need support in order to adjust to COVID-19? The difficulty is it's extremely hard to separate what was an impact of COVID-19 and what was some other impact. So for instance, our canola sector has been hurting over the last year and a half, largely from market access issues with respect to China. But on top of that, we have downward pressure on oil, on the entire oilseed complex because of COVID-19. So it's very difficult to get cause and effect. Now, in terms of the question of, is the sector hurting? Does it need help? I'm probably not going to answer the question, but here's statistics that are coming out of Statistics Canada simply for receipts. It's not net income, and it's done quarterly going back to 2016. And you can see the first quarter in blue is relatively the same for crops across years. So the question is, what's going to happen as we go into this year? Well, we have relatively strong wheat prices. Canola prices have recovered a lot. In Ontario, yes, corn prices are weak and soy prices are weak, but I would say over the course of the year, we're probably not going to have much change in terms of cash receipts, maybe a 2 or 3% decline. Livestock is a bit of a different story. First of all, you see this blue line is stronger this year than in previous years, and this is a reflection of Asian demand because of African swine fever, primarily in China. Two Tuesdays ago, I talked about some of the price suppression that was occurring for both live cattle and hogs. And I think as we go throughout the year, there will be some price suppression. Whether quantities will go down is another issue. And maybe you're expecting something of the order of about 8%. All of these things are neglecting something. They're neglecting expenses. You would measure producers' welfare on the basis of some kind of net income measure, and it should be very disaggregated, but we're doing very simple things. Well, what happens to expenses? A lot of them are associated with crude oil prices. So expenses are coming down as well as revenues. So it's difficult to just measure, how badly is the sector hurting, and the government has to be able to respond to that. So a very legitimate question is, do existing programs address the problems faced by producers? I think the most relevant question to begin with is, where does the shock originate? So for instance, if the shock is macroeconomic and economy-wide with respect to a reduction in income, I think we saw IMF projections showing that Canadian GDP would decline by 6% over the year. The appropriate way to address it is with macro policy, primarily monetary policy, and sort of some fiscal policy around the edges with financing and addressing particular sectors. If it's a more specific question, then the policy should be targeted at the problem. So there have been a number of labor problems which have been identified in the supply chain, especially with respect to food processing, and it's appropriate to address those head on, not with more broadly based macroeconomic policies. So this is a very simplistic conceptual model of a supply chain going from farm inputs that are both farm owned and purchased. The inputs go into a production function, which then gives you supply. There's a supply disposition, which allocates the production into export markets and domestic markets. In domestic markets, it goes through processing, wholesale, and finally through the retail sector. It's useful to identify the shocks. Probably shocks are occurring at more broadly spaced than I have, but as you go further down the supply chain, once you hit processing and into wholesale distribution and retail, the shocks tend to be larger. So this is an indication of federal macro policies that are being applied. And in terms of the federal government providing backstop support, what they have attempted to do is address issues of financing and broader issues with respect to wage subsidies. So these elements would affect primary production, yes, but not so much as food processing, wholesaling, and especially the retail sector, as we've had, a large portion of it shut down because of COVID-19 measures. There are broader types of money that are being provided. I think if you're old enough, and you took macroeconomics, you'd recognize the term helicopter money. So this is money that's going directly into Canadian emergency response benefits, smaller things like GST credits and dealing with childcare. Well, as you provide these broad benefits, they're going to affect income, which in turn affects consumption and will work its way up the supply chain. So the question is, where do we target these measures? And I think the more broadly income-based measures have to be dealt with macroeconomic policies. I'm just throwing this very quickly up. It's by the Parliamentary Bureau, Budget Office, sorry. And if you look at the URL, you can go on there and get an indication of each of the programs. I've highlighted a few, but I'm not going to talk about them in any more detail than I have now. What about existing federal provincial programs? The banner program for agriculture is the Canadian Agriculture Policy Framework, or CAP. An unfortunate acronym, given the European Union had already used it, but we've never been very original in Canada, so it will steal other people's ideas. CAP, the expenditure on a segment of it known as business risk management has declined over the last decade. It started out at about $2.8 billion federally and provincially, and I think this year it's down to about $1.8 billion. So there's a certain amount of discontent that government expenditures have gone down. How well do the different components of CAP address the question? Well, the first is AgriInvest is really a subsidized savings account. So producers can contribute up to 1% of their net sales into a savings account, and the government will match it. This amounts to an annual direct payment to agriculture. It's the closest, I suppose, we come to a lump sum transfer. The criticism of the program, of course, that always happens. The criticism of the program is that it's not being used. There's $2.6 billion sitting in unused accounts. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture happens to be asking for about $2.6 billion additional money. So AgriInvest is there, not being used. AgriStability is the sort of the banner program. It's a deficiency payment based on a net income for a whole farm. If your net income falls by more than 30% of the margin on your whole farm, or your net income on the farm, then it starts paying out. Now, the criticism has been that it's unpredictable in terms of payouts, and the process is too slow. But certainly with respect to COVID-19, the losses will be big enough to trigger payouts, plus a system of advance payments is in place. And I'll explain that in a moment. It already was in place and the government has finagled it. AgriInsure is a multi-peril crop insurance program. It covers crop production. It doesn't cover price losses. Most of the effect with respect to COVID-19 will relate to price losses. So this depends more on extreme weather conditions, and if we have a bad year, there'll be a payout, otherwise there won't be. It won't depend directly on COVID-19. Agri-recovery deals with catastrophic losses. It hasn't been used very much. Certainly it's a candidate for COVID-19, but it's not designed to cover market price declines, but it will cover some extraordinary costs with recovery. And this is one area where it's been used. Last Tuesday or 2 Tuesdays ago, I talked about maintenance programs with respect to feedlots and the Canadian cattlemen asking for a set-aside program. Well, this is where it was addressed. Advance payments are a federal government program where producers can borrow money in the spring, plant their crop, take it off in the fall, and repay the program at that point. And there has been some increased flexibility with respect to how the program is administered. Okay, let's look at the new programs. I've stolen this particular configuration from Agriculture Canada. You've got relative sizes for different sectors. We're worried particularly about primary agriculture in orange and the food and beverage sector and the wholesale sector in various shades of green. Now, in terms of primary agriculture, I have to actually move the pictures of everyone here. Sorry. There's $5 billion showing up. That's not $5 billion that's transferred to the sector. What this is basically a loan guarantee of $5 billion. So it allows Farm Credit Canada more borrowing ability. I talked the previous Tuesday about the Canadian Dairy Commission using intervention purchases to support prices. Well, this $200 million is backstopping that. I talked a little bit about AgriStability and it not paying out. There is a system of interim payments. It's been increased from 75% or 50% of your payout to 75%. So they've relaxed the terms. There's a set aside of $125 million. This is what the Canadian Cattlemen's Association asked for. They're not happy with the amount that they got, but it is money on the table. The $77 million is basically here being addressed largely to food processors just to get back online, and also provides additional money for things like personal protective equipment and making the workplace safer. Finally, there's smaller amounts of money, $50 million, for unsold inventories of food that would go into local food banks or local distribution systems. So here's another reference for monies that are being spent. This is coming from the Department of Finance. You're going to have to click on the URL, but you click on each of these boxes, you can get information about the amount of money that's being spent and just how it's being done. So what's the impact of these new programs? Well, there's several principles. You want to ensure that the new programs don't distort markets. And this is, for an economist, this is a real issue. The remedy should be as close to the shock as possible. tried to emphasize that before. If it's an income shock that's reducing consumption, then you should be using some sort of a macroeconomic policy to deal with the income shock. And it should be addressed at consumers. You don't want to address one particular group of consumers. Let's say it's local food and you want to promote the hell out of local food. Then if you do that, what you are going to end up doing is perverting relative prices and reducing choice for people that don't want to contribute and increasing costs throughout the system. So you want these things to be as broadly based as possible to address issues like labor constraints in the supply chain and to facilitate the movements up and down the supply chain, including alternative channels. Specifically, you don't want the programs to distort production decisions. They should be time limited so that they're not entrenched. They should be transparent. You don't want them conditional upon giving or producing a given level of output. It's what economists call a decoupled program, and you want them to be non-discriminatory. Certainly, you don't want to attempt to reform existing programs, for instance, these business risk management programs in the middle of a pandemic. That's something that the Canadian Federation of Agriculture has been asking for. You want to avoid trade restrictions. There is always going to be this strong push for protectionism. The question is, how do you keep domestic and international markets open again? Is there a role for international competition? We only have to look back a few years to 2008 and 2009, and there was a world food crisis. And there was definitely a recognition that there was a need for a role of international cooperation. The food crisis resulted in price surges, especially for commodities and crude oil, which were exacerbated by the use of export restrictions. So Valeria will describe the use of export restrictions in a little bit more detail on them, but they can either be quantitative or they can be export taxes. The WTO has very weak disciplines with respect to quantitative measures and nothing at all for export taxes. The problem with these measures are that they will depress the price in the home market, but increase prices in world markets, and that severely affects food security. So export restrictions were a major cause of price volatility in 2008, 2009. I'm going to give a very simple or a very trivial example. This is out of a paper I'd done in 2015 with Henry Ann in food policy. We're looking at price volatility here, not surges in levels. We're looking at really variations in prices or variances. And essentially what the diagram is showing is the relative impacts in terms of inducing volatility across a bunch of things. So the trade measure refers to an index of export restrictions. Crude oil prices, higher crude oil prices would lead to more volatility. Likewise, higher ethanol production would lead to increased volatility and lower stocks. As we go into COVID-19, Valeria will describe a few cases that were used, but you see that there's no pressure on crude oil, there's no pressure on ethanol, and stocks, as Brent showed the first day, are pretty high. So if you start to intervene with respect to export restrictions, it potentially would have more effect this time around. Thankfully, it hasn't really materialized. There have been a number of examples of attempts at international cooperation, and I'm going to just describe one of them, or three of them, sorry. The first starts after the Second World War. They were known as international commodity agreements. They were part of a rebuilding process that started with the Bretton Woods Agreement and the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the International Trade Organization failed and we got the GATT. These agreements were brought in just to try to repair the world. The worry was that there was surplus production at that point in time, and the attempt was to deal with these things with export controls and buffer stocks. Ultimately, they failed, and they failed quite spectacularly. I would argue that the reason the GATT or the WTO or the GATT doesn't pay attention to export controls is because these international commodity agreements were in place. Valeria will discuss the Agriculture Market Information System. This is launched by the G20 after the World Food Crisis. Essentially, it's a data repository, and it's also a platform to coordinate policy actions in times of market uncertainty. I think it helped. There were price spikes in 2012. So I would argue that it's a somewhat better solution. In terms of the best solution, there's been quite a bit written about the effect of G20 member governments, the central bankers and the ministers of finance, that together with the IMF were able to stem what was already a fairly severe recession and made it a lot less severe. So what about cooperation interprovincially, cooperation nationally, and international cooperation? You need very clear objectives. There's something known as Tinbergen's rule that says you need the same number of objectives as you have policy instruments. Anything beyond that doesn't work very well. So there has to be this targeting of objectives. You want transparency with very objective data, and you need adequate surveillance. But most important, you need strong commitments by political decision makers. And I really fear at this point in time, sort of given the state of the world, we do not have that commitment. And with that, hopefully it will lead into the next section. I'm going to stop sharing at this point.